apply them to the profession that is changing rapidly as well. And so it's a very interesting time that we're living in, because there's a lot of self-reflection and acknowledging of past wrongs, as well as what do we do moving forward to ensure that those transgressions of the past don't occur again. So it's really important for me to be here and to listen to you and to get a better understanding of what our collective needs are. So thank you for inviting me.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mary Mendoza, and I'm the Vice Mayor of the City of San Fernando. And it's such a pleasure to be here with everyone. As I was listening to everyone speak and seeing what your careers were, well, I worked at Los Angeles Christian College for like 32 years. But I see you all as educators, and we learn, we're coming from different fields, different forms of employment, different, the radio, the salud, the community. And I think that I'm just really eager to see what the council has to say and learn.
The All About Me generation, but anyway.
Cultures, several ways of understanding the world, that can be problematic. So let me give you another example. I lived in Glendale for many, many years. Glendale has a lot of Armenian population, right? So one time speaking with a friend from here, from the Valley, they told me, oh, but Armenians are so rude. And I said, what do you mean? What do you mean by that? And they said, well, they speak so rough, and they don't always say please and thank you. So what this person was doing was judging somebody else's language according to their own pragmatics, according to their own linguistic use. We may speak English because it's our lingua franca, but we may still follow the pragmatic rules of our heritage languages and cultures, and that's what's going on there. Moreover, we live in a state where the two most numerous languages, in this case would be Spanish and English, here in San Fernando and all over the state. But it is important to remember that they are both immigrant languages. Spanish is immigrant, English is immigrant. Spanish has been here 200 years before the arrival of English. It was the language that replaced indigenous languages. Otherwise, we would be speaking Tatavian right now, or Tongva, Fernandeño or Gabrieleño, according to how the Spanish called these languages. But eventually it was Spanish, the language of power. English took over, but still, Spanish is the language of a large, about 50% of the population, actually in California. So one of the things that we do in Spanish, like Diana has helped me to introduce, is apodos. Apodos are nicknames. And they are assigned to people because of some characteristic trait, right? While considered offensive in many modern societies, traditional villages all over Spain and Latin American countries that have Spanish as their official language use these apodos. So I'm going to give you another story. I come from a little village called Santa Ana. So the patron saint is Saint Anna. I am Anna. You can imagine every other woman is Anna in my village. So how do we distinguish one another? Well, in my group of friends, there was Ana la Gorda, Ana la Visca, Ana la Negra. I was Anita, thank God, because I was little. But we all get an apodo based on a characteristic. There was another thing, very funny too, that I'm going to share with you before I pass it on. There was a guy that was everywhere. You would see him everywhere with his bags, and we called him Dios, God, because he was everywhere. And one day he got lost, and the entire village was like, we lost God. ¿Dónde está Dios? So these are the kind of apodos that we have, right? Nicknames. Being ignorant of these linguistic facts can lead people to judge too quickly the intent of the speaker, right? So while speakers in the US need to learn the pragmatic rules of English in this society, when speaking our heritage languages, like when I speak Spanish, we will continue using our linguistic behaviors, right? And of course, as in the case of the Armenian example I gave you earlier, this can lead to harsh or wrong assumptions on the speaker's intent. Another very important thing, and with this I close, is in my field we study things that are really, really, really important. So yes, you do need a linguist in your life, because there is something that can have big consequences. Linguistic discrimination, which we call linguistic profiling. Research has found that many people make racist, snap judgments about people with diverse accents. And by accents, I mean we all have an accent, but if you don't have the standard American accent, you are judged more harshly, and this has consequences in all kinds of ways, potential employers, real estate agents, loan officers, health providers, right? So going back to the beginning of my talk, why does this matter? Why does the scientific study of the language matter? It matters precisely because language is such an integral part of being human. And as Gloria Anzaldúa says, ethnic identity is twin skin to my linguistic identity. I am my language. That's that big part of our identity is our language. Thank you.
I'll come back to speaking on the job for a minute. I realize I got an earlier script, not the latest one. So thank you, Anna, for that. Next, we want to go to Luis. Luis is a longtime leader who's worked tirelessly for LA's indigenous community, including the growing Oaxacan community that has migrated from Mexico and Guatemala, who recently found themselves standing up and marching the streets following the vile insults that Mary Martinez spoke of their community that was secretly recorded. Luis advocates for indigenous people's rights, languages, and language revitalization. He has the huge job of interpreting and the responsibility of understanding those vast nuances we speak of. Their first language is a native indigenous language. Their second language is Spanish. And as they move to LA and other parts of the United States, learning a third language, English, making them contrary to how they're viewed and spoke of. They are among the most linguistically educated people in the world. The indigenous in Mexico and Central America have faced historic racism, persecution, elimination, and coming to this country, these latest scandals evident that they haven't escaped it. They have many struggles here. So Luis,
Thank you, and buenos dias, everyone. Good morning. Like Diana said, my name is Luis Lopez Resendis. I am the director of the Center for Indigenous Languages and Empowered with Comunidades Indígenas en Liderazgo, which is an indigenous women-led organization working in South Central Los Angeles, a community that is home to many different indigenous communities from Central America and Mexico. I belong to the New Sabi community, which is a Mixtec. My family speaks Mixtec to Sabi. At CELO we work on visualizing the migrations of indigenous folks, indigenous communities to the United States, not to be confused with them being Latinos or Hispanics or any other identities out there that have been used. We do identify ourselves, I identify myself as a Mixtec man. CELO is located in South Central Los Angeles, which is unceded Tonga territory. For us, it's important to recognize that we are still in occupied indigenous lands. We are migrants, we are also indigenous, so it's important to recognize that. I think in this conversation on the audio links, it's important to note that the Latino politicians were talking about a community that is often being erased in history. You know, I studied history in college, and everything I learned was about a story that didn't represent me, didn't represent my community. You know, we have this idea that communities were disappeared a long time ago, especially the Mayan communities, that somehow we were taken by the aliens. There's some stories that talk about that our languages are not spoken, you know, that our languages are dying, when in reality, in my house, there's no other language that is being spoken other than Mixtec. And that same goes to different households of different indigenous migrants. When we listened to the audios of Nuri Martinez and Kevin De Leon and the others, they were referring to the indigenous Oaxacan community in Koreatown. That's where I live. They were referring them to as Oaxaqueños, short, ugly Oaxacans. Nuri Martinez did make a comment that, now we were working in shoes, making the reference that, now we were seen as civilized Indians. And for us, these conversations didn't surprise us because, unfortunately, in the greater Latino community, these are comments that are being used to identify indigenous communities, indigenous peoples. There's this idea that because we come from rural areas, we don't have the ability to create knowledge, the ability to be our own voice. So oftentimes we find people that want to speak for us, want to represent indigenous communities. These politicians, they went to many different communities and took pictures with the communities when they were doing their campaigns. There was a lot of frustration within the Oaxacan community because, many said, we consider them our allies. And unfortunately, when we are talking about allyship within the immigrant movement, we find a barrier as an indigenous organization, and that can be sometimes the racism and the discrimination that it keeps being reproduced within the Latino community. For us, it's important to talk about that because it keeps affecting, the migration and how history is being told towards indigenous communities. When these audience meetings were public, we organized with the Black community in response to the structural racism that exists within the Latino community. We were taken into a meeting where we were being called out for, standing with the Black community. In a meeting, I remember that we were being told that it is because of indigenous peoples opposed to development that we couldn't get our things together. And now, in this struggle to call out racism within the Latino community, we were a rock, we were a challenge in the Latino progressive politics. So, in a really nasty meeting, we were called to, align with the Latino politics because we were calling out, the problems and the challenges that exist in the current Latino politics. So for us, that created a whole layer of struggle because there was a lot of community members that said that Kevin De Leon shouldn't resign. We're still calling for the resignation of Kevin De Leon. And for communities to really think on how we use certain words to describe people. Many times my family were called indios, patas rajadas, oaxaquitas, oaxaquitos. We have suffered, we have lived through many things. However, our community continues to organize. There's a really brilliant organization that happens within many indigenous communities. We come together to celebrate life, to party, to organize across borders. I think in the Caribbean they call it transnational indigenous organizations. My community is part of that process of organizing themselves. So in the city of Los Angeles, la city of Los Angeles es casa común de muchas personas. It's a communal home of many different peoples, many different languages across the United States, and many different languages from across the world that exist in the city of Los Angeles. So the mission of Cielo is to be able to create spaces to visualize this migration and to work so that we can create a home that welcomes everyone. In the work that we did during the pandemic, we created a map that is called We Are Here, and that talks about the presence of 17 indigenous languages that are spoken in Los Angeles County. And this is work that has been done for a very long time. I know there's a chief from the police station here. We have worked with the Los Angeles Police Department to create language cards that that goes in English phonetics. So now, and this is after an incident that happened in 2010, where Maya Kicheme was unfortunately lost his life due to a misunderstanding. The Los Angeles Police Department didn't know that this person didn't speak Spanish because this person was from Guatemala. That ended up on, that cost the life of Manuel Jimenez Chun. And since then, we have been working to create language cards for every single police officer in the city of Los Angeles that identifies indigenous migrants and by who they are. So now we get calls by the police to ask us, I have this person who speaks a Mayan language, not to be confused with a dialect. A lot of people call indigenous language a dialect. And then, CLOC work is to help facilitate communication between an indigenous interpreter and a person who doesn't understand those languages. I just want to leave it in there so that we can have more time for people. I'm grateful to be here. Somebody mentioned that it's the first time being in the San Fernando Valley. This is my first time being here. But indigenous peoples have been migrating to different parts of the county and across the United States. And it's important to talk about that because there's a lot of things that need to be fixed in order for us to serve those indigenous migrants who are arriving to our cities.
Thank you, Luis. You can clap.
And I remember the look of my friends. I broke her heart because we were good friends. Okay? I share their experience because, remember, something we use to raise in language, it doesn't make us a bad person, but it's a responsibility to rise above it and correct the wrongs. That's extremely important. And we do it by sharing our stories without judging, but rather trying to learn from each other, learn from somebody else's mistakes or the good things they do so we can do better in the future. Okay? My family is of mixed heritage in Mexico. My grandpa was, he claimed to be, in addition to being a Mexican indigenous person, he claimed to be half Chinese. I haven't gotten my DNA test yet, so maybe I have some Chinese in me. But he was proud of it. And my mother, well, we were like 5 brothers and all of different colors. I have a black brother, I'm the whitey in the family, and my 3 sisters are all shades of brown. I can tell you that I was treated differently because I was white. I know what privilege is based on being white. I was called El Güerito, the little whitey guy, but it sounded cute because I was white. That was why it sounded good. But my friend was never called Negrito. My friend was called El Negro. And we just use the language like, and sometimes it doesn't hurt. But we don't bother to ask people how they feel about how they are called. And it's important to keep that in mind before we do it. In Mexican culture, we grow up to accept some of the terms because they might not be necessarily pejorative. But we need to understand and know whether those people being addressed by those names, how they feel about it. That's extremely important. We need to educate ourselves and listen to others. Okay? As a reporter, I realize how powerful language is in that sense. And how long we have to go as a society to overcome some of those issues dealing with the language and how it impacts people. And that's the reason I said to Diana, I was here at the previous panel covering it, and I said, I need to share my experience because I think people can learn from it. Okay, so if you have any questions, I'm here to answer. I'm a reporter. I know how powerful words are. We need to understand culture. We need to understand the nuances of the language. And hopefully we'll be able to enlighten each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Caesar, for that wonderful testimonial. So now I want to each try to efficiently ask you a question based on this very complex topic that has many tentacles, right? And while we are having the privilege of really kind of trying to begin to unpack these issues within our own community, we also know externally, because of how we are viewed externally during Trump and COVID, we certainly heard those horrible use of terms that he used to define us and to define the Asian community. I don't need to repeat them, but the impact that they made. And as a result, there were hate crimes and actual violence that occurred, and the fallout continues. So Anna, when you sweepingly refer to a group with the use of slur, and that list is very long, you do dehumanize. People no longer consider the member of that group as a person, as a human, and it becomes easier to dismiss them, to look down on them, and even harm them. So how do we maintain what's good about our language versus the harm that our language can do? Is it perhaps standing up when we're unjustly having our language incorrectly viewed? So how do we change when the aspects of our language are harmful? Is it simply enough to educate for people to be responsible for what you say, especially when these use of terms become generational, they're handed down, right? And Martha knows, because we had these discussions, I was very appalled to hear people in this community very freely using terms that I thought were the most abhorrent and disgusting, referring to immigrant community as chunts, chunte. It's so low. And my reaction was to view that person as being very low. A principal recently shared with Martha that her kids at her school use the N-word frequently. And that has been passed on to them by someone. So Anna, when we talk about these things and trying to discern and unpack which are cariños and which is very hurtful and damaging, and we, in our last panel, discussed Nuri Martinez a little bit more, and the use of the word changuito, which I will stand by, and I was probably the only journalist that spoke to her afterwards. And that use of the term for her was discussing behavior, how the child was running around on that parade float. No one will defend the things she said about the indigenous community in Koreatown. But for the use of the term changuito, that is a different situation. And for the Black community, it became the lit match that was used as for political opportunity to take over the Fed. And people have stopped and not thought about how this was a well-planned situation and people were illegally recorded. I will not defend Nuri about the indigenous community at all. But I want people to really think about what occurred so that we no longer have the political power, the city council, we have no one sitting as the president, and no one bothered to come to this community and ask this community, which was represented by her, what they thought. But the world weighed in, including ridiculously President Biden, who knows nothing about this community. Okay? So as a result, $7.5 million was spent for a special election. And we are awaiting those results right now. So when we talk about the power of words, that's huge. So getting back to my question about the cultural aspects and how do we create the change to discern that. And it was very disappointing, and I'm saying this myself, to watch supposed Latino leaders all fold like an umbrella and watch the difference when the African American community all stood up for Mark Ridley Thomas in defending his good track record. And the difference was everyone was so anxious to write letters for Murray to resign. Everyone. Anna Sher, even members of the most progressive Chicano Studies department in this country were quick to write those letters. And no one stood up. That was an opportunity to stand up to say, you know what, we have nuances in our language. And changuito is not the Googled word that is a vile word in the African American community. I absolutely understand that. But there is a nuance that you don't understand. And that was the political lit match that changed years of hard work for representation of this Latino community. So with that very loaded question, I will turn that over to you, Anna.
Thank you. Yeah, loads to unpack there, right? When we talk about words to refer to people, and going back to my presentation earlier about nicknames, apodos. Apodos or nicknames, they're used with very close people, with people that you know, that you trust. In my village, which was very homogeneous, calling somebody Ana la Negra because she was darker than me, and I was Anita because I was smaller, wouldn't be considered offensive. I still wonder if my friends that were called Ana la Gorda, Ana la Flaca, Ana la, physical attributes, they carried trauma. I still wonder that. I think that as we evolve as a society and realize the traumas that we inflict on future generations, and we take steps to correct that, the language follows. Language changes. Language is constantly changing. And it will continue to change, and the language belongs to the people. And now we're a lot more mindful, even in apodos, amongst ourselves. Now, taking that out to a whole community, referring to people that you don't know by a nickname, that is very dangerous. You don't know them, you are assigning a value. Your works are a reflection of a value. This is what discourse is. Our beliefs, our set beliefs as our society come out in the way we present something, in the way we say something. And therefore, that is very problematic, especially in a very heterogeneous community, like Luis said, where we had many different types of people. That should never be, right? A word to represent the whole people. That doesn't happen to white people. Why? Because they have many stories that represent them. But minority communities tend to have a single story told to them from the majority, and that is what is very problematic. So how do we maintain our language? Well, our language changes. There's nothing we can do about it. We don't like change, but languages change, and that is the reality. Do we not use apodos, nicknames, cariños? Yes, but with those that you know, that you trust, very close to you. As an elected official, that was a very problematic move, but then, of course, there's many nuances, like you said. Why was this person being recorded? She probably wouldn't have said this if she knew she was speaking in public, right? So there are many, many nuances to that. That's absolutely true, but language changes and it will change. It doesn't change necessarily the character of it, but it changes the way we say something. Right? And that's why the way we say things now is very different from the way we say things 40 years ago, referring to professions, for example, that were very gendered. Now we're trying to move away from that, and there's a reason for that, right? So I cannot give you a definite answer of what we can do, but it is true that having awareness, educating ourselves, goes a long, long way. It does. And again, this is very important because, as I said at the beginning, we use language all the time. We even use language when we're sleeping. It's 24/7, so we take it for granted. And we need to start looking at language as an object itself. So to be able to study, to understand it, to have better control of it. Yeah? So I think awareness of the words that we use goes a long, long way. And like Cesar said, when we say something that we regret because of the impact that it has, then you take responsibility.
So then, based on that big storm, right, political storm, we're not all answering the same question. Okay, we have separate ones. Fails, and he got a big laugh out of it, and he even had a little song that he sang, and got the biggest laugh out of it, and and we knew it was affectionate, and it wasn't anything that made me feel negative. There are so many stories. Ruben the last time talked about growing up and the conflict he had with Black and brown community, and one of the guys in your neighborhood, right, who was very, very slow, and you all called him Rapido. Right? And people knew, the nuance and the humor and the wit, and there's a lot of wit, a lot of sharp wit that comes with these terms, right? So I guess what I am trying to point out is that unfortunately sometimes in our community when someone from the outside takes issue with that, we're so quick to fold rather than stand up and say, wait a minute, you just don't understand it. You're not a Spanish speaker, you didn't grow up in this culture, so who are you to dictate how I should speak?
I agree with that, and like I said, it's not like you can abuse their term. You can refer to your child like that. Your intent is not offensive to your child, to your family member, to people in the community, but using it to refer to somebody outside of the community might be very problematic.
Right, but the difference was she was among her colleagues who were also Latino who understood that use of the term.
Yeah, but
but when it was secretly recorded and got out. But again, there's no justification of the other things that were said. And I will let you speak even though I'm speaking too much and you're dying to comment about this. But I have another question for you, Cesar. So go ahead.
Just to follow up on what you were saying. I was called a changuito many times in Mexico because I would just jump around like all crazy with a lot of energy, and so was my brother. So it was never understood as a racial term. Although it makes me think twice about it to call my brother, who passed away already, a changuito now because I guess I've learned from all the current experiences that it can be an offensive term, and we never asked him how he felt about it. And we do know that some people in Mexico have used it also as a racial term. Very few. For the most part, it means a very hyperactive kid. But we need to definitely understand culture, the value that is assigned, and at the same time realize that when cultures meet in a city like Los Angeles, sometimes it's a clash, and we better learn from that clash. And I guess the lesson potentially for some politicians is like, don't use language so loosely because you might be being recorded. I mean, I guess that's the lesson. And on the other hand is be as kind and considerate as possible, so you don't offend people even when you don't mean to.
I guess the point is all of this gives us pause. And I don't know if we start our meetings by looking for bugs in the room as well, but it gives us pause to consider this. But my concern, I guess, is the loss of culture, because language is our culture, shapes our culture. And who but ourselves has a right to the maintenance of our culture? So Luis, the community of Koreatown is the center for LA's indigenous community. What do you think is needed most? That horrible situation did put a spotlight on the community that many don't even still know how vibrant it is and how important it is and how much it's grown. Some of us have spoke of the need for electing an Indigenous resident to City Hall. What is your point of view about that?
I think what is needed the most is to really rethink the way we refer to certain communities in the language that we grew up speaking with. Because this term, changuito, it is racist. It is really racist. It's not a fact that this conversation happened in private or not. The way we refer to people is racist. And let's call it out. Nuri is racist. Kevin De Leon is racist. And all these elected officials that were taking part in that conversation is racist. You think if they were so comfortable speaking in a private room like this, what does it mean to have these conversations in public? How does this reflect on the way they run, a campaign on, this issue? It may be normal for people because we grew up accustomed to this, but let's rethink, we grew up accustomed to speaking in a very racist way of certain as certain individuals. So it is a conversation that needs to happen, The main thing that needs to happen in Los Angeles is to have the Latino community reflect on how they use language to speak about the Asian community, Asian Pacific Islanders, the Black community, the indigenous community. Yes, our grandmas, our grandpas spoke different like this about people, but we keep reproducing that, and it is a conversation that needs to happen. The how language was composed in Mexico, in Guatemala, in Central America, across Latin America, to identify or to erase a certain population of people. There were campaigns to try to get rid of the indigenous communities, to educate the indigenous person so that they can think the way the white Latinos, white Mexicans wanted to run a country on. So those are conversations, and I know it's uncomfortable, and we have been in situations where these conversations get uncomfortable, but it's a reality of things. We all know, or we all have the auntie, the tío that talks about indigenous folks in a different way, Indios, uneducated folks, about Black communities, calling them morenos, using this racial, really violent terms, and this is why at Cielo we call this language violence, because it's a violence that keeps reproducing, that it is important to talk about, because we're not gonna go nowhere if we think, okay, we can't talk about certain things in private because we might be, there might be somebody listening to us, Better to rephrase that and say, we must really analyze how we use language, because it comes from a really racist history, and this is something that needs to be acknowledged at the dinner table, We have all, I'm pretty sure if we go through our family's phone contacts, there's somebody who is gonna be named El Moreno, and people might think, that's not racist because that's just a funny way to call someone. No, that's racism. That's racism. That is something that needs to be examined and really think about, because if there's something that is really affecting communities is the way, Latino community has been using language to refer about other people and not willing to change, because if my community as an indigenous community learn to speak Spanish to communicate those needs, it is important for communities that are not indigenous to learn the importance of making sure that we are creating a safe space for everyone and that we welcome people into this city. You know, it's not a matter of having an elected official that is indigenous, but it is a matter of talking about how racism works in different spaces, from the white and the Latino community that is becoming a majority in the country. You know, these are spaces that these conversations don't have to happen just in the city of Los Angeles.